So you're looking at me the whole time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Audio's okay?
Audio's good.
Okay. So, after all of this, so tell us who you are and tell us how you started in the business.
Okay,
How
yeah.
about that? Little resume.
All right. Yeah, well, my name is Paul Efron, and I started as an aspiring actor out of high school, thinking that that's what I was going to be doing, and and figured I'd put myself through school by working as a stagehand, and well, the money spoke for itself at that point. Started missing classes, started doing things, working as a stagehand, and then I started hooking up with a company called FM Productions in San Francisco, which was originally formed by Bill Graham and had been taken over by another gentleman named Tom Mendenhall, who took it to added a whole corporate aspect to it of doing corporate shows, but also at the time was building most of the rock and roll sets in the touring industry. So through that, I started doing a lot of automation, staging automation for rock and roll tours. And then when I wasn't touring, I was working as a production electrician doing lighting for corporate shows. So it was kind of a mix and match, and learned a lot during that time, needless to say. And then in the early 80s, we were doing special events, and FM was involved with presidential convention, the Democratic Convention at the time, and the 1980 Olympics, and these were all beginning projects for me, things where I was working as a set electrician on. And from there I started touring, and both as an electrician, as a lighting electrician, and then as an automation, special effects, set carpenter / electrician, and did that for several years up until the mid-90s. At that point I started, I'd already started working as a lighting designer, working with other lighting design firms, and Light Switch being one of them, and then started one of my own. And from that point on, I've been working as a lighting designer and primarily doing that. So in a nutshell, that's my background.
So let's talk about being on the road. Let's talk about touring.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me your favorite part of being on the road.
My
What
favorite
did you
part.
enjoy the most about being on the road?
I think it was the it was
Speedy, just answer his question by saying, my favorite part about being on the road. So answer
Okay.
the question with the
There we go.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, my favorite part of being on the road was the travel, but also meeting so many different people in so many different places, and seeing and being in a place for just a short period of time where you really felt like you came and took that place over, especially on the larger tours where you were with really large crews, and it literally felt like you took that town over. That was cool, and you met lots of different people, and you felt like you were bringing something to that city or town that really excited them at the time. People were lining up for days, had been anticipating the events, they'd been buying tickets, they were still wanting to get into the shows. It was just an exciting time, and working with exciting bands at the time as well. I was really fortunate, to actually have the opportunity to work with really cool acts. Some of those choices aren't really out there right now.
Tell me some of the bands that you worked with when you were on tour.
Pink Floyd, U2, the Rolling Stones, ZZ Top, David Bowie. My first tour was actually with the Bangles in '87. Who else? Bon Jovi. I don't know if I've left anybody out, but that's pretty much the mix of them.
National and international tours?
Yeah. Many, especially the bigger ones, would do both. They would do an American leg, sometimes a fall leg, then maybe take a break, then go to Asia, Australia kind of thing, usually Europe in the summer. So yeah, we would do most of the world.
How is it working with crews in different parts of the world, doing the same show in different locations, sometimes working in different countries?
Different challenges, and different cultural challenges, to say the least.
So Speedy, sorry, you guys say, so working with different crews in different parts of the world was always a challenge.
Yeah, I always forget that part.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so whatever question I ask, then you answer with the question.
Okay. No, it's good to tell
How's
me
that?
these things because I have no idea.
Yeah.
We tell everybody. So
Right.
you're
No,
not-
that's
I always
fine.
forget, and they always remember.
I'm as humble as I need to be. You know what I mean? So answering it with the question.
Yeah, it's. I guess it would be working the same show in different countries. How was that?
Working the show in different countries was, presented different challenges, both culturally and technically. And that could be said for within the United States too. The different cities had different qualities of crews. You know, your stagehands were comprised of union and non-union entities, but in some cases, you know, for example, in the South, a lot of the IATSE locals are also part-time firemen. You know, so and then when you get to Europe, it's a whole different bag of beans there too, because every country had different quality stagehands. You know, the French always had very good stagehands. The Germans had great stagehands. The Hungarians always had the best riggers. You know, it's and then Japan was another whole story. You know, this is a place where before you could even call for a forklift, they've already carried this thing over the seats and onto the stage, and very, very good at emulating and simulating things. These guys would come in and they'd watch your show in advance, and then by the next city they just set it up. You know, you wouldn't have to tell them anything. So yeah, no, it was challenging. And then, you know, you go into a show in Russia. At that point, it was still the Soviet Union when I was there, and it was the Red Army was your crew. And these guys didn't know anything when it came to what we did. You know, they were all eager, but they were, you know, more interested in how many American cigarettes you'd give them. And, you know, and I know when we were there at the time, you know, Macs were new and computers were new, and the laser guys were using computers. And I remember the video game at the time was called Shoot the MiG, and these guys were backstage playing Shoot the MiG, you know, under the stage, and it was, you know, they'd never seen anything like this before.
Take me through a typical day on the road. Your typical day from the time the show starts loading in right up until showtime.
Well, you know, usually it would all depend on what number your truck was, where your truck was, and after a while you would know about what time your truck was going to unload if you were doing an overnighter or whatever. And at that point, you either decide whether you want to sleep right up to the time that you got to get off that bus and the truck door opens, or whether you're going to get something to eat before.
So your truck number in amongst, how many trucks are we talking about? Let's pick one tour, the Rolling Stones. How many trucks on the tour?
You know, it's been a while, so I don't remember exactly what it was right now, but you know, there was at least 10 trucks of steel, and there was probably, I've got to say, 10 or so production trucks on that.
So on the Rolling Stones tour.
On the Rolling Stones tour, how many trucks?
Sorry.
No, it's good. And I'm looking at you like, oh, you're going to ask me a question too?
I'm a lazy editor. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I need all the reminding I can get.
That's okay.
So on the Stones tour, for example, there were two different systems. An A and a B system was a red and a blue system. We're talking about the Steel Wheels tour in particular, and they had two separate steel crews, and also had leapfrogging elevators, which is what I was working on. We had an elevator on that tour, and so my stuff would actually, it wasn't a typical tour because we were unloading prior to production. So we would have a couple of days early where we would come in and do all of our stuff, and then the Universal crew would come in with the main production, the lighting, sound, and all of that. So we supported them, and then my stuff went in along with that. So, you know, a typical day on that show would mean arriving. A lot of times we flew on that tour. It would be unloading that truck, and then in my case, our stuff was really heavy. It was like 4 tons for the main dolly for the elevator. So it was about making sure that the deck was sheeted, was double skinned with plywood so we wouldn't go through the deck. And then assessing your stagehands was always a big part of the deal. You know, you get up in the morning and you're presented with so many guys. So you know, you want to learn their names. You want to find out which ones can take charge of the others. And especially with that particular tour, and all of them for that matter, you're dealing with safety and rigging and, you know, pulling up big heavy things over people's heads. And
these are people that you've never seen before.
Never.
You're working with for the first time.
Actually,
you have no idea.
You know, in general that would be true. These people would be, but then there were times where I actually knew some of these stagehands, especially here in the U.S. And actually from prior tours in Europe, I would sometimes have some of the same stagehands present themselves in front of me and go, "Oh, hey, you again." So yeah.
Haven't seen you in a couple of years.
Yeah. So, but generally, yeah, you know, and also, you know, the language situation was always interesting in Europe as well, because I speak Spanish and I speak English, but a lot of times Spanish would actually help me out a lot in other countries like France and Italy. Although there were, you know, times where the stagehands, although they would understand you, would prefer to, you know, if I would ask them, so would you like me to speak to you in Spanish or English? If I was to ask an Italian stagehand that, they would always say, "Oh, hey, we're Italians. We don't speak Spanish." But then there'd always be one in the crowd that did. And by, you know, within 10 minutes or 15 minutes into it, they were much happier to have me speak Spanish to them and swallow their pride and understand what I was saying versus continue, so there was a lot of that going on. And in France, it was the same thing. I could always find one person on that crew that spoke Spanish. And there, all of a sudden, I had a translator.
So the show is loaded in. You're in rehearsals. Tell me what happens during rehearsals.
Well, rehearsals really there's other than the beginning of a tour, when you're launching a tour, is when you have really legit rehearsals. Or if you're doing a video shoot or something like that. Otherwise, you're really dealing with sound checks. And sound checks typically happen show day. Depending on the size of the tour, would depend on whether it's the same day you load in or not. Some of those larger stadium tours, you're loading in for multiple days. But during sound check is usually, for me, there was work going on. I know that when we were touring with Pink Floyd, sound check typically was when we were putting up what we called the sushi maskers, which were these big PA maskers that went along the front of the stage to mask the PA. So we would typically be setting those up as these guys were sound checking and just blowing our heads off.
I want to make a note here. When he says the word masking, I think it'd be really great to have like either a lower third or something that says what masking is.
Absolutely, definitions.
Because nobody knows.
That's a good idea, man.
You know what I mean?
You can do like a bottom ESPN kind of a scroll.
Yeah, masking equals hiding something.
Is this okay? Is this the kind of stuff you're looking for?
It's great.
Okay.
It's perfect.
This was
doing great.
I was working with Cheeks at that time, and he was a head carpenter. So, and I remember also at the time that a lot of the guys on the crew would make fun of me for wearing ear protectors because I wore headsets, because I knew from a daily basis, you're getting blasted by these guys on a daily basis. We used to think the sound guys were doing it to us on purpose, but no, it was timing.
And what kind of, what kind of sound level are we talking about? And this is during sound checks. This isn't even the concert itself.
Oh yeah, no, and a lot of it is just, pick noise and all that stuff. It was just, it was just loud. It was a full-blown sound check. It was somebody beating on a drum repeatedly with the PA like here in your ear, because we were literally building these flats that we had to put out. It was the kind of thing. It was like, oh, it's time to put up the sushi maskers, and I was like, oh no, that means it's sound check. But also, it's also goes for lighting as well. Sound check usually occurs while you're trying to focus lights. It's usually when you're up in the rig and you're focusing lights that the loudest noise is happening, and it is just a coincidence of timing. So yeah, going back to that though, it's sound check was the closest thing that we would have. And usually sound check would be a variety of noise and testing, and individual instruments being tested, and then usually the band would come in usually later. So that would actually, there'd be like a preliminary sound check, and then you have your act comes in, and then they do a sound check, and they probably play a couple of songs or whatever's going to make them feel comfortable in that venue on that day. So it could be a half an hour, it could be 15 minutes, So, but no real rehearsal, so to speak. All of the gags that we did, whether it was flying pigs or raising mirror balls or making screens fall over, those were rehearsed already. We might run them during the day to make sure everything's working, especially on, a lot of the automation that we did was big, heavy stuff. The elevator on the Stones was an elevator, literally an elevator. But for example, the big circular screen on the Pink Floyd tour, that thing rose up off the floor, tracked down stage, and then literally at the end of the show it would fall over. And by falling over, I mean we would slack some motors and we would tighten others, and with that the thing would start to fall and catch itself and then lean over. And it was fully automated, run off a PC actually, with various encoders. And that particular screen, I guess it had 4 winches that went up to the ceiling and back down, and then it tracked across I-beams. So it had separate encoders counting its vertical and horizontal movement. And by having that, it enabled us to do some really cool stuff with it, and break a lot of lights in the process. There was a whole, that whole screen was literally stood up, sitting on a furniture dolly. It had like 4 or 5 furniture dollies and laid flat, and then as the motors picked it up, with ropes attached to it, riggers had to control it to where it lost its center of gravity and popped. And if it wasn't done right, it would fall forward first and clip the stage and usually rip 4 or 5 aerolites off the screen. So there was a lot of technical casualties off of that thing, and a lot of that really did require rehearsal, and it was actually an ongoing fight I had with the rigging department, because they would always blame me for breaking their lights, and I was like, you guys need to rehearse this with us. We can only push the emergency stop button so fast. Does that make sense? You can only do that so fast. So yeah, we had some sort of rehearsal, And then we also had gags that we rehearsed in the beginning that just never were going to happen. They weren't going to work, and they would get cut.
What was it like? See if you can describe for me the atmosphere and what you were feeling the first time the show is performed live before an audience. Now you've rehearsed it, you've been somewhere, they've gone through all the songs, you've checked out all of the things that are going to happen during the show, but this is your first night with the show in front of an audience. Tell me what you're feeling. Is it excitement? Is it nervousness? The crowd's coming in. This is your first time. And you're behind the scenes. You're backstage. What does it feel like?
It's a very unique feeling. It feels, the first show that you do is always all of everything you just mentioned. It's exciting. There's a realm of nervousness. You want to protect your gig. You want to make sure that you pull it off. And usually the beginning of a tour is, in effect, goes back to what you were saying earlier, it is your rehearsal. Those first couple of stops, you're just trying to get it up on time, make sure it works and not hurt anybody, and then get it down and get it to the next city. And there are times in that beginning process where everyone's looking at each other and going, this is just way too much. And yet it smooths out in a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden you're into your road life routine. But yeah, that feeling is, it's indescribable, especially with some of these acts that, and I do remember specifically when I went out with Pink Floyd the first time in '87, the Momentary Lapse of Reason tour, they hadn't been out for so long. The level of excitement on all ends, including myself, just to be on that tour was huge. And I remember doing a show in Montreal, and I actually missed the first show in Ottawa because I got chickenpox in rehearsals and got sent home. So I got back, and I missed the first show, and the first show actually had issues because the steel started buckling from the weight of the rig. The rig was so heavy. So they had to re-engineer it after that. But then I came back out in Montreal, and it was an indoor gig. But when that show ended, the people were so excited that they didn't just give them a standing ovation. It was an ovation where they stood and cheered for 15 minutes. And it was one of these things where we were looking over our shoulders going, will this end? This is, never had I seen that kind of, and never did I again on that tour. I mean, for the next couple, the first wave of that tour, yeah, it was a lot of excitement. But and anyone that's on that tour, and if you were to interview anyone that was on that tour, would tell you the same thing about that night in Montreal. There was nothing like it. Talk about decibel level. The decibel level of the crowd itself cheering was indescribable.
Well, I have to imagine that there's the excitement that the crowd experiences, but then there's the excitement that the crew experiences, which is totally different.
Absolutely.
Right?
And the excitement that the crew experiences is, it goes without saying, is even prior to opening the show. Each individual departments, I remember the laser department being so excited when they were beaming off one of their effects and seeing how bright it was, and like nothing anyone had seen before in their mind, and probably was. That level of excitement, and it would go on. And each of the departments all felt like they were pushing the envelope on stuff that they had never done before. And the engineering of it, like I say, the weight of that rig at the time, they've gotten heavier since. Everybody was always wondering, although, and engineering was different back then. Things really have to be engineered now. Back then, not everything got an engineering approval. It just was what people felt was safe. So,
was there a moment during the show where you thought something was going to happen and something else happened? How did you deal with surprises, or how did you deal with somebody's got a cue coming up and they missed it that you were hinged off of, or what do you do during a show when something goes wrong?
You do the best you can when something goes wrong. That's really all you can do. And things do go wrong.
Tell me about working your job specifically with Mick Jagger. Tell me about that.
When I was working on the Stones with Mick, actually my role on that tour was to tour an elevator. And the elevator was an elevator not to be seen by the audience. It was about 110 feet up to a crow's nest. And the whole notion of that elevator was to secretly transport Mick to the top. during a guitar solo, during Sympathy for the Devil. So while Keith was doing his solo, we're taking Mick up to the crow's nest, and at the end of the solo, he's magically appearing and singing up above. So the entire gag was based on this elevator, and there were 2 of these elevators. So my job was both to get him up there, but also to get the camera person up there, because someone was going to shoot him as he was up there and shooting him from below on the crow's nest itself. And so yeah, he would get in the elevator, and we'd take him up, we'd drop him off after we dropped off the camera person, and then he'd do his thing, and then he'd come back down, and we'd go get her, and we'd move on. So it was a really quick gag with a lot of technology involved at the time, and it was a really cool elevator too. It went fast, and it was like 100 feet. I can't remember exactly what it was at the time, and it was all worked on limit switches, which to this day would probably be looked at. It was all Allen Bradley controls. It was fairly primitive, but at the time worked very reliably, very safely.
Well, we've seen video of it, and we'll be taking a look at it while you're talking. And when you say it moves fast, you know, we're targeting people that maybe would have a difficult time understanding. We're talking about something that's 10 stories tall that is moving really fast.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like a regular passenger elevator that you would get in a building.
No.
This is something that's going zip to the top.
It was designed very much on the same concept of what construction elevators are designed. And it was fully engineered. You know, this was definitely not just, you know, it was, all the stuff was engineered to some degree. Anything that had weight or, you know, that kind of liability. But yeah, it ran on tracks and pulled up by winches that were based in the bottom of the unit that would send cables purchased over shivs on the top of the head block and then lift the elevator. And then as it went up this track, it would click limit switches, which would speed it up, slow it down, and stop it in specific places. We could adjust these. The limit switches were literally on bars, and the bars would cheeseboro to the tracks. And the tracks were, I think they were 8 foot tall, basically big truss sections with a male and female receptacle that would come together. So you'd have to haul them up. You would rig drop lines and pull them up, and then with a person on each side on the scaffolding, you'd get them into their position, drop them in, and then cheeseboro them into place. And if the steel was off, then it was a lot of banging and moving without, you know, banging the track around. But then once you got the whole track on, then it was about putting a head block on the top and then taking the steel cables off the drums that were 100 feet below, getting them up to the top through the shivs and back down. And the way we did that, the shivs were split shivs. So you would, once you pulled the head block up, which was, you know, the head block was a challenge because there was nothing to purchase above it. So you would pull the head block up underhanded, and then with 2 people, you'd lift it up and get it into place. And then once it was cheeseboro into place, then you had a set of shivs to work with.
Then you could start hauling up.
So at that point, then you run your rope through the shivs down to the bottom, and they would attach them to the cables and take tension on the cables. And then you would run the motors out and run the cables up to the top, and you'd stop, open the split shiv so you could put the wire rope through, and then close it again, reattach your rope. You'd take tension on it, and the guys on the bottom would hold the rope. You'd reattach the rope again. Actually, I take that back. You didn't have to do that. And we got it to go fast where we had clips. So we could clip into the eye bolt on the end. So we would open the split shiv, and that way we could put the cable in, close the split shiv, they'd take tension again, then we'd hit the motor again and run the cable all the way down to the top of the elevator. And once we were at the bottom on the roof of the elevator, we'd attach it to the elevator, take tension, ready to go. At that point, the elevator needed to learn, or the motion control system had to learn its limits. So you would put it in a manual mode, and you would run it slowly up to the top. It would learn all its limits, come back down, and then you were good to go.
Well, let's talk about being in different countries. I want to get back to that, different countries and dealing with the language and how different countries would do things differently. You hear a lot of stories within our business about Japan and how you show up in Japan and you think you're going to use a machine to do something, and instead 50 or 100 people will show up to move something that you assume is going to get moved by a machine. Talk a little bit about what it was like working in different countries.
Yeah, well, working in different countries was always interesting, sometimes challenging, and specifically, I mean, Japan. Japan was just a marvel. The whole way they work in Japan.
Tell me about that.
The the way that when you go to Japan, I mean, if you've never been there before, then you only know what other people that have been there can tell you. And then you see it for yourself. But very departmentalized in regards to, I mean, they know how to do pretty much anything they need to, or they learn how to do it. And a lot of times they will come out and watch your show and your load-in before they even attempt it. And then they just do it. But they will have, you know, one group, if you're doing lighting, one group might be just putting in gels. One group may just be running cable. Rigging was always interesting there, and because of the fact that that was not their forte. Hanging motors and chain motors and that whole technology was not their forte. If you wanted them to build a scaffolding 100 feet in the air, bamboo scaffolding, bang, it was up there. Hanging a motor was, it was also the way their crews worked too. The guy in the air, what he said goes. So I remember a lot of the times we would always tell them, they would take the chain motors and they kept spinning the chain motors to straighten the chain. And we're looking at them going, it swivels, dude. Who cares? And they would smile at us and nod. But they were going to do what that guy up there told them to do. And if he said straighten the chain, they were going to swing that thing around. So it was it's an honor thing too over there to do things right. You don't mess stuff up. You do what you're told and do it right. And so there's a lot of what am I trying to say? Not that they take their job seriously. There's a lot of pride involved in doing it right. They want to do it right. And you can't say that about everywhere you go. Both in the United States and in Europe, I've had great crews, and I've had crews that I just wanted to, shoot myself over, because you're going to be there forever. And keeping your patience is also important too. And I mean, I watched a lot of people treat crews in different ways. I've always lived by you treat people the way you want them to treat you. And I've been a stagehand, and I know how I like to be treated. I don't want to be treated like a dummy. And if I do something stupid, well, that's not cool either. But, there's a lot of times going from day to day. If you're getting 5 guys, you're getting 10 guys, you're getting 20 guys every day, you try to learn their names. Or at least the key guys that are going to run. It's always important in my mind to learn who the key guy is. There was a guy on Stones who used to do spots, and he used to always get his guys, and the first thing he would say is, which one of you guys is the stupidest? And then he'd say, you're number 1. Number 1, you're going to tell everybody what to do. And he would tell that guy what to do, and that guy would get, but what it did is, as soon as you ask who the stupidest person is on the crew, they're going to single some guy out. He might not be the stupidest guy, but they're going to single him out. And so you put that guy in charge. Now he's giving these guys orders, right, and it's giving him something to do. So if you can keep the people's attention, because that's half of it, is keeping your stagehands' attention. Are they interested in what you're doing? Are they interested in getting a pass for the show that night and one for their girlfriend? Or are they just interested in getting out of there as fast as they can and making money? But on a rock and roll tour, the more hours you're going to put in, the more money you're going to make. So it was a very diverse, every day it was a different group of people. And on the big shows, just trying to fill those calls sometimes gave you people that may have never done any of it before.
Did you ever run into a situation, well, I'm sure you have, where you show up and the crew's never done anything like this before, and this is all brand new to them?
Oh yeah. And especially doing the college circuits. If you're doing a college tour, and I mentioned earlier I did the Bangles, I think it was like the very first tour I did. And I was the electrician on that, and it was always interesting because on a college tour you're going to get kids, you're going to get students. They're not stagehands, There was a point where we would take their driver's licenses so that they would come back for the loadout, because a lot of them would be there, they want to see the show. They're either getting college credit or they just want to see the show. But then come loadout, you got nobody,
Did you ever run into situations where maybe the loadout crew didn't show up, or there wasn't as many people as you expected for the load-in or the loadout or the show?
Sure.
Sure. A certain amount of people are supposed to show up for load-in or the show or the loadout, and they don't show up at all.
Oh yeah.
Not as many people show up.
Oh yeah. No, and actually that's a great question, because there's going back to the college thing, just to elaborate on that, there were times where you could never take for granted that people understood what you meant. Most stagehands understand when you say, coil up the snake. They understand that, and they coil up the snake. Now, you say that to a college crew, and you walk away, and you could come back later, and all of a sudden they've taken the tape off the snake, and they're coiling all 5, 6, 10 cables up in separate coils, telling people to drop things in. They just start dropping things in. But when it comes to not enough people showing up, yeah. And also knowing, anyone will tell you that if you're going to do a show in Italy, you order way more crew than you need, because a whole lot of them aren't going to show up, and a whole lot of them are going to disappear at lunch and not come back, and just disappear.
What about speaking about lunch? I always found it interesting, depending upon where you were, what lunch breaks were, what dinner breaks were, depending upon what country you're in.
In regards to the...
Like, how long is it going to be, or what do you have to have? Is there a certain kind of meal? Do you have to have this? Does it got to be that? Is it a half an hour? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? Do people go away and never come back?
Are you talking about the local crew specifically?
Yeah, local.
Yeah, I think that differs everywhere you go. And yeah, as I said, in some countries, I know that in France, and not so much on the rock and roll tours that I was on, but like some of the corporate gigs we did there, we made sure to have catering. Because if we were going to send them off, they were going to go, they don't go for an hour or a half an hour. They just go for whenever they decide to come back. Right. Whereas if you catered it, and you actually had wine at the meal and, culturally did what they do, why would they go anywhere else? Right. So you bring in a great French caterer, and the road crew's always going to love that, and you feed everybody, and you make sure there's a couple of bottles of wine on the table, and unlike other places where people might just get smashed and not be able to go back to work, they don't. Whereas if you let them go off and give them an hour, that means nothing to them.
Feed the crew, keep the crew.
Yeah, feed the crew, keep the crew. And France is just an example of that. I mean, France is as you know, French like their food, and God bless them for that. They love their food, and they, So if you don't give them that break, where that you at least know where they are,
they're gone.
They're gone.
They're gone.
There's a good chance they're gone. There's a real good chance they're gone.
Talk to me a little bit about. I always want to ask, what's your favorite place, or what was your favorite show? If you could pick a show, well, actually, let me rephrase that. If you could pick a favorite place that you went, that you thought to yourself, I'm never going to be here again. This is the most amazing experience I'm ever going to have in my life. Are there? I guess it would be. Is there highlights? Are there places that you just, that night in Greece, or that?
That's a very hard question for me to answer, I have to tell you. As you're asking me that question, I am just flashing all over the world. I'm thinking of Greece, I'm thinking of Moscow, I'm thinking of Paris, I'm thinking of New York City,
You think about how lucky you are to visit the world and see the world almost through the eyes of a local, because you're there working with local people. You're not visiting as a tourist.
Right.
Right?
Right. No, it's true. But there were, I was thinking of Venice too when we did a show. We put the entire Pink Floyd show on a barge in front of San Marco Square and watched, and I have photographs of this where you see in the beginning of the morning, I did these 180-degree shots, and you can see the buildings and the building tops and even scaffolded construction areas, that had plastic come on them. And as it filled throughout the day, not only did the harbor fill with people in boats, but now the plastic was getting ripped down off the scaffolding. And next thing you know, you've got 400,000 people filling that square. That was impressive. And thinking, this is really cool. This is something nobody's ever done before.
Well, a lot of the technology, like you were saying before, a lot of the technology and the things that you guys were doing was stuff that had never been done before. There really wasn't any kind of guidelines for, how do we test this kind of thing?
That was really cool, I got to tell you. The catering had its own barge. We had a couple of the semis were living on the barge itself. The entire rig was pulled out there with tugboats, and then pontooned out to a separate little mixed position. It was, was that the highlight of one of them? Doing a concert at the Palais de Versailles was another, amazing thing. I'd been there before, but never did I imagine I'd be doing a concert right in front of it.
Are you seeing the country a different way? Are you seeing the culture a different way?
Yeah, I think so. I think you see, the time when I toured, and I haven't toured for a while, but when I toured, I was very lucky to do it when I did it. Both the acts that I worked with at the time, and both the way the world was opening up. I go back to Berlin right now to where the wall was, and it's not there. But yeah, going back, you think about moments you remember. I remember being there with Pink Floyd in front of the Reichstag and setting up there the day after Michael Jackson had done a show there. But that's not what stays in my mind so much. What I remember was the sound of the barking dogs in East Germany on the other side of the river. Seeing the wall and seeing all the people up against the fence, listening to the singing. We're talking about sound checks. Listening to the sound check, they had no idea. They knew what was going on. They wanted out of there. They wanted to be there. And meanwhile, just on the other side of the river, these people are partying. And that was really, really powerful to me because, and that was, right in the same time where it was a few months later where we were like the second concert to be allowed to be given in Moscow. And during the time we were in Moscow was right when Tiananmen Square was happening. So the world was changing, and it was changing fast. Foreigners were being, weren't allowed into Red Square for that whole week because it was the first openly democratic Congress that they had in Russia. And we were watching it all happen and feeling a part of it, when you're coming in with an act like that had already pretty much dazzled people in every other part of the world. But here's a place that's really been deprived of all of that. And you talk about seeing how people lived in Russia, and I've been back since, and it's changed in so many ways. I don't know if, how much for the better or not, but it's a completely different place than when it was the Soviet Union. Those were big moments for me, most definitely.
Tell me about, in the span of a month, and pick any tour you want, how many different cities would you hit?
Well, it would differ. It would differ. With a big stadium tour, you may be doing one to two cities a week. It's usually one a week. On a smaller tour, or something under 10 trucks, or something like with the ZZ Top, the recycler tour that I did. You could be doing 3, 4, 5 shows a week. It's usually 3 in a row, maybe. I don't know what people are doing now, but it could be 3 in a row and then a day off. Or you travel, or maybe the travel day needed to be that long just to get you to where you were going. Usually those tours were planned and designed so that they could squeeze in as many stops as possible. Unless you're doing, that's the other thing with some of those tours is you're doing maybe multiple dates in certain cities, especially the bigger tours like U2 or Pink Floyd and Stones, which is great because you're much better off. The back-to-back stuff gets old really fast.
How was it being on the road with a group of people for that amount of time, visiting so many different places? Tell me about the camaraderie. Tell me about how tight you get as a crew working on a show.
When you're on the road with a crew of that size and that magnitude, it's, first of all, you're going to be on a bus with, at that time we were talking, probably 12 bunk buses. And in Europe they were always 2-story buses. But, so you've got, if you're lucky, you got 10 people on that bus and you got 2 junk bunks. The junk bunks is where you throw all your stuff and everybody shares that bunk with, extra luggage and so on and so forth. But, you've got a back lounge and a front lounge on that bus, and those are common areas. And so, you always get a couple of people that always want to maybe not get in their bunk and sleep in there, and they get run out pretty fast. But it's a family. It's a very, very tight family, and people are weeded out, or they fit in, or, but you are very tight. And I never served in the military at all, but I remember working with someone who was an ex-Navy SEAL, and he hadn't had a lot of touring. He hadn't done a lot of touring. He actually ended up doing a lot of touring down the line. But he was telling me how much being on the road reminded him of being in the military, and that camaraderie of being overseas in basically a foreign land with your group of guys, your family of guys. And I thought about that, and it made a lot of sense to me. Like I say, I can't say firsthand, so I can't. But it did feel like we were invading a town, with our gear and our people, especially some of these places. You're taking over their bars, you're taking over their restaurants, you're taking over your deal. And some people were very culturally sensitive, and other people weren't at all. I tend to feel that and maybe it's because my family's all, from out of the country, but I would watch, sometimes there were people on the crew that would embarrass me, expecting the menus to be in English, when you're in France and things like that. But yeah, it was a very tight alliance, and it got closer, obviously, the longer, once you're out there for 6 months, you've kind of weeded out the people that aren't going to make it. They've already gotten fired or whatever. And so now you're tight with all those people, and by the end of it, you're really tight. And I'm still in touch with most of those people to this day.
What? Tell me the feeling that you get when I don't know, this happens to me. I'm just curious. Tell me the feeling you get when you've worked with somebody for a really long time, and then you don't see him. And then about a year or two later, you find out when you're walking into a venue, this guy's going to be on your crew. How do you feel? What is that like?
When you walk into a venue and you see somebody you haven't seen for a long time, and the first thing is you want to. The worst is when you know this person and you cannot remember their name. Now that could be just age. I don't know. I don't know. And then so once you get and the worst is when you really like that person. Like you know that person. You know you've spent a lot of good times with them, and you don't know their name. I mean, I've had people come onto one of my crews that I went to high school with in South America. An aspiring actor who he just happened to be in Florida, and all of a sudden he was on my crew. This is a guy I grew up with, and that was just quite bizarre. And that happened a couple of times because after the first time he'd make sure to be on the call when I was coming into town. But yeah, there's a lot of catching up to be done at that point. And a lot of times you meet people that you toured with that are now working on a local crew years later. You come back through. So yeah, it's always cool. Once you get past, once you can remember who they are.
Right.
Sometimes you do right out of the chute, and other times.
It's like seeing a relative that you haven't seen in a long time,
Yeah.
only because of the emotional roller coaster that you go through on a show. Sometimes is you bond.
You see a lot of stuff happens like that, and and going back to the the whole comparison to the military, people die out there, people get hurt, there's casualties. It's nowhere near the scale, but the danger happens every day. That same 4-ton piece of whatever it is that you're offloading off that truck that can flip over and snap somebody's knees, every day you go through that with different people. Your road crew's the same, but the stagehands are different. I mean, we had things on the 94 Pink Floyd tour, winches on these wheels that every time they went down a ramp, we were always biting our teeth. Because if they went over the side, and they hit anybody. And we managed to get through that entire tour, I might add, without hurting anybody until the very last stop in London where it did go over and snap a guy's legs. So, that it's a never-ending situation that you're living in out there and people do, I wouldn't say they get blasé, but it does become routine, And it always tends to amaze the people, the locals, because they're looking at some big thing going, wow, how do you do that every day? Here, let me show you, It doesn't take away from the responsibility or the seriousness of it every day, but after a while you do become, I guess there is a numbness to it. There's a numbness to it's some tours and you're working in the rain every day for a while. It's just raining and it's just muddy and you're used to being soaked and wet.
And that's just part of the deal.
It's part of the deal, and if you're not going to deal with that, you're not going to last. It's not. And there is a feeling that goes along with that that's also very satisfying too at the end of the day. That you trudge through that and you get it done and the show goes on as it should.
Right.
So, but it's not easy work, and it's certainly not for everyone.
Well, the thing that we're trying to present to the audience, I think, is that when you go to see a concert, you have no idea who's behind the scenes and what's happening during the show.
Right.
To support the act that's on stage. Yeah, you see the band playing, but there's all these other people running around doing all these different things that are contributing to the look and feel and sound of the show.
And that's part of it. I mean, that's really what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be doing this so that the audience sits there and go, wow, the lights were cool. They have no idea how many people are on that tour, or how many people are behind the scenes, just like you said. And it is very valuable to let people see that whole aspect of it.
So I'm in the audience and I'm watching Pink Floyd performing on stage, and I see the band. Give me an idea of how many people total, just an estimate, during the show, how many people are actively working to support the show?
Think about that. There's during a show, a typical I'm thinking like on the Stones specifically. I think we had 120 people on that crew between both crews. So I would, without really knowing, without really going back and thinking about it, I think if you're counting security too, and you're counting,
I'm talking. I would be talking specifically about show running crew.
I bet you were. It was in the. I would say it was in the realm of 25 to 35 people. I may be way off. It might have been more, you know, because just sitting here, I would have to think about like what was going on. You know, there were a lot of us that did different things too. You know, when I wasn't doing the elevator, then I was doing inflatables, and there were other people that, you know, you would wrangle your resources for the show crew. I mean, it's very rare that you get to sit on the bus during the show. Some people do, you know, but usually you got something to do. You know, you're usually not going to be the set carpenter and also be the pyro guy. You know, but you could very well be doing. In my case, I picked up all kinds of other things to do because the elevator was the elevator. It had its moment. So I would do band risers, I would do inflatables. You know, I would ground rig for people. So yeah, there was a lot of resources that were wrangled and reused, you know, during the show. So the show crew, it would vary. It would vary in size.
And then the one thing a lot of people don't realize, I don't think anybody, when the show is over and the audience leaves, something happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Actually, I bet you those numbers, you know, were probably even higher when you think just on the front of house crew alone was probably 12 to 15. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, you know, okay, I'm in the audience, I'm done, the show is over, wow, I'm walking out, that was a great show.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what happens.
Well, it all.
You guys just don't walk away and
No,
go to sleep.
No, and you want to get on it. You want them out of there. You
So
want
the
those
show-
people leaving it out of the way.
The show ends, what happens?
Well, you pretty much attack the stage first. You know, it's...
When the show's over.
Yeah, when the show's over, you attack the stage first. That's the first thing you do. You know, the audience has to clear. You don't want to think about anything out in the house at first. So you're dealing with, you know, each individual department has stuff they need to deal with. So if it's band risers, if it's, after a while you learn which ones of your cables and gear can come out first. And you also have a conscious knowledge of this as you're installing it too. And it's usually a fight between departments too, between people that are inconsiderate about that wound their stuff around yours. And again, as you go through this, you know, a couple of weeks, couple of months down the line, this is all nice and neat. There might be 100 cables running in one direction, but everybody's got theirs in the order they should be.
It's a giant Tinker Toy or erector set that gets built, the show goes on, and the Tinker Toy or the erector set gets taken down. Usually
Yes, it
in
is.
an 8 or 12-hour period sometimes?
Faster than that. And I mean, right now, I'm hearing that the Miley Cyrus tour, which is bigger than all of the ones we're talking about now, you know, I think they're 25 trucks or whatever, they're loading that thing out in 3 hours. That's amazing.
And it takes how long to set up?
Today, you know, they come in the morning and they do a show that night.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. But, you know, again, having, there's good crews and there's bad crews and some that get better than others, but bottom line is knowing, you know, who should go in first. And that's good stage management. That's where your stage manager or multiple stage managers come into play. Because these are the guys who know that that truck really needs to unload before that truck. And these guys are going to need this many guys to get their stuff out, because if they don't, they're going to hold up the next truck. Especially in a stadium tour where you got one hole, you know, a ramp with one hole that the trucks can come down, and maybe you can bring two, you know, every venue is different, so maybe you're bringing 2 trucks down that hole, maybe you can get 4 of them out on the field. You know, in a stadium type situation, if you can get trucks out on the field, and maybe you can, maybe some of that stuff like front of house, you get a truck right out to the front of house and that whole thing loads right into a truck out there. Maybe you can back 2 of them up right to the front of the stage so you can roll stuff in from there. Now you're talking, you know, 3 trucks, and then you got 2 in the hole on the ramp.
So it's logistically a massive challenge.
And it's really, this is where your stage manager is your best friend or the person you hate the most. And a really good example of that was the U2 Zoo TV tour, where we had really big stuff that was on flatbeds. We had big lifts that laid flat on flatbeds, and the only way to get them in there was either to fork them off, you know, and bring them in, and then we had these big Grove lifts that had to be driven down onto the field. They, you know, these things were huge, so they're not getting in there without going through the tunnel. So we typically were always loaded in last and loaded out last, which made no sense whatsoever. And as much as we'd ask, you know, to get a truck in, they'd go, yeah, and then they'd cram another, to the point where we had to literally rebel, to the point where, because we had big equipment, we would literally like hijack the forklift. You know, the stage manager would send the forklift, and we'd go, no, you come over here. We'd pick up something big and heavy, and we'd clog up the tunnel with it, because that way they couldn't bring in another truck. I mean, we tried to be nice for a really long time, but it got to the point where we were, you know, had these flatbed trucks out in the parking lot, and we were forking them around the building piece by piece because they would never let us get in there, and then acting like we were whining about it. But what it really was is they weren't thinking it out. You know, and again, that specific tour, I had gear that got spread across 3 trucks because they didn't want us there. You know, it's like they didn't want to deal with the logistics of what we had, and because it was big, heavy stuff. But you know what? You got to. And in the end, we got to the point where I had gear, my control gear was on the back end of one truck on one night, then it was on that's not the way it should work. Your pack should be the same every day. You know, and it was the same kind of thing where I had other departments that were they wouldn't give me stagehands, and I had all this stuff that had to come out from underneath the stage. Well, all of a sudden that ended up in the nose of the show power truck. It was in their interest to get my gear out of there as fast as possible to load their truck. So after a while, although the stage managers were ignoring us and basically boning us every night, the show power guys were like throwing us their stagehands, and we were working as a team, free-for-alling it on our own just to get out of there. You know, this is not something that happens all the time, but it goes back to your point that it's really important for that to be coordinated and coordinated well, and for people to be working as a team. Otherwise, the end result is, you know, it's not just about everybody trying to get back on their bus and be done for the night. It's really about everybody rolling together as fast and as safely as possible.
I look at, there's a couple of programs on television where they build a house or they rebuild a house in, I don't know, 2 days or something. I think the biggest, if there was a, I'm trying to parallel for the audience now, what it takes to put a massive concert together. It's a coordinated effort, but it's almost in high speed. Mm-hmm. And then it all has to get taken down, loaded into trucks, moved to a little look, and set up again and again and again, mm-hmm. and again and again. So you're right, the logistics and the priorities after you do it more than a couple of times, right?
Yeah, and that's why it's advanced. You know, when it's done well, it's advanced. That's why you have a site coordinator on all the larger stuff that's there early to make sure that all the steel and the deliveries are set up. You've got all that infrastructure to set up in advance as well. Mm. And I can see how it could be compared to military operations, where they're coming in and there's nothing there. They have to provide all their own infrastructure. That's really what it is. You're providing your infrastructure.
You're building a small city.
Yeah.
Almost, right?
Yeah.
In some cases.
Yeah, you are.
You're self-contained. You have your own power.
Uh-huh.
You have your own lighting, electrical system. Mm-hmm. You have your own PA system. You have your own house that you build with scenery. And then you've got your own television station because you've got all these television cameras. So in effect, you're your own little city, mm-hmm. right? Moving around.
It's your own little city moving around with its own population. It's got to be fed.
Is there anything that when you and I know this is going to be difficult, but you've been so many different places and done so many different things. Are there things that you just can't forget, like you were talking about in Venice, mm-hmm. you know, on the canal, on the boats? Mm-hmm. Big, small, medium, you know, you flash on so many different things because
I do,
of so many different places. But are there times, are there situations that stick out in your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah, lots of them. There's a lot of things that stick out in my mind, and I'm probably not even touching on a lot of them. You know, I remember the pig that we used to fly on Pink Floyd. It would fly out on a cable out over the audience. Inevitably, that pig had issues. It was a radio-controlled pig.
How big is this?
It was about as big as this room, or bigger. The joke a lot of the times was people would be looking for me and during the day, and I would be inside the pig.
So a small truck, let's say.
Yeah, it was, you know, what do we want to say? It was probably inflated. It was, I want to say, maybe like 12 by 12, you know. I mean, I literally would inflate it to test it in the daytime, and I would open the zipper and climb inside it because the eyes were lights, and we'd have to, if one of the eyes wasn't working, you had to go in and figure out why the eyes weren't. And people would be, you know, yelling at me, "Hey, Speedy, get out of the pig." It was the big joke, you know, he's in the pig. But I remember, well, I know in the beginning of that tour, we used to blow pigs up. That was the big deal as a promo, is they would inflate them over cities and then blow them up. But I do remember, and very vividly, and I think you know Joel McGarrion well, rigger. He was one of the riggers at the time, and you know, we were all a lot younger back then. But I think this was in Munich. I'm not sure where it was, but there were times where the pig had issues, like I said. It would get stuck out there or whatever. But this particular time, and it had a fan running in it that ran off a battery, so the fan kept it inflated. And this particular time, the pig got stuck and deflated. So it was basically hanging out there like a used condom, you know, on this line. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier about, so when things go wrong, you know, what do? Who makes that call? What do people just kind of do best they can? Well, before you know it, there's McGarry, and he's underclimbing that wire. And he underclimbed that wire out over the house and grabbed that pig and drug it back. You know, while all of us watched him thinking like, are you nuts? Are you out of your mind? You know, and there was a fantastic, and in the rain, I might add. And the reason, you know, you talk about flashing back to these things is I remember the photograph in the newspaper the day after. It was somewhere in Europe. I want to say Munich, and I don't really know why, but yeah, and you know, here's this picture of him with just water streaming off of him, hanging upside down off this cable. And it was a front page picture. And frankly, Pink Floyd was a front page picture pretty much everywhere we went, whether it was a shot of the show or something like that, which was kind of, you know, quite extraordinary. But yeah, that was a big moment. That's something I always remember. There were plenty more, you know, plenty more. We were talking earlier about the pyro guy, Clyde Taft, who we both know, and we had, you know, when we had excess pyro, and it was 4th of July, and that was Munich too. I don't know what it was about Munich, but we, you know, everything was in the truck, and he decided he was going to do a 4th of July show for us, and it didn't go off, and he was cruising around it trying to figure out why it didn't go off, and I was filming him, and I'm thinking to myself, it's going to go off, and sure it did. He went up like a match. You know, these are things you remember, you know, and luckily he wasn't hurt that bad, you know. Clyde's not with us anymore.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, luckily, at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is ironic, you know, that sometimes, you know, we survive all these things to go a different way, but Clyde was a great guy.
You meet a lot of great people out there, and you develop relationships with people that last a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And because of what you go through when you're on a show, you're as tight as a family, which is why I think, you know, going back to this whole military thing, that it also you're able to rely on people, I think, more than you would ordinarily, because you've been shoulder to shoulder for 6 months and you've been all over the world.
You very much can rely on people, and it's often like it is in other things in life, where the people that you really didn't like to begin with end up being your best pal, and the people you can rely on the most.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there were some people out there that when they first came on, I just didn't like these people. I really couldn't stand them. And then, you know, all of a sudden they were getting fired and you didn't want them going.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, whoa. Are you trying to, you know, understand how that happened, because they were really good people? And those, you know, I'm thinking of someone specifically right now who I'm very good friends with today. He's doing just fine. Right. And when I met that guy,
what a dick.
What a dick. Yeah, what a dick. And he would probably admit that he was a dick at the time too. You know? Well,
it's interesting, because I think sometimes, and again, this goes back to the camaraderie that happens. You're living and working with someone 24 hours a day, months on end, in situations that are unrealistic to some people.
Right.
You know, it's raining and you're going to climb up that tower?
Yeah, of course
crazy?
Of course I am.
Yeah, it's the
I do it every day.
It's the gig.
Yeah.
Right?
And to most people in that crew, that's no, I mean, you know, when you're looking at some of the stuff today, you just see the way people talk to each other. You know, as if they couldn't care if you fell off the top of that tower.
Right.
Yeah, whatever. But if you did, they would.
Oh, of course.
You know, if you did, you know, they do care about you. It's just that everybody, and again, I keep going back to it. I bet it's very similar to that in the military, where you kind of numbed out to the danger that you're in, but they're for each other all the time.
I got your back.
I mean, I think, again, I keep saying that because I've never been in the military, but it just, to me, seems like it could be a very similar type of thing. You're always kind of living on the edge.
Yeah.
You're really not knowing what the next day is going to bring. There's certain things that are consistent, but there's certain things, the Murphy's Law thing applies every day. The shackle's not going to open when you want it to. This is going to jam. This isn't going to line up. You know, it's not working now. Why is it not working? It worked last night when I unplugged it. You know, something up there isn't working. Oh, shit, I got to go up there with a propane soldering gun, you know.
Well, there's situations during the show when a critical piece of equipment that you know is coming up on a cue that all of a sudden has failed, and it's got to be fixed, and the clock is ticking, the cue's coming up, time is running, and the audience is completely unaware.
Well, and some of these things you're talking about are life and death things. Some of them are not. You know, you miss a lighting cue, somebody might get upset. But some of these automation cues were, you know, I know, you know, for example, the whole screen thing we were talking about earlier.
Pink Floyd.
Yeah, Neville and I would swap, you know, one person would run the e-stop button and would stand under that screen and watch it.
Now, how big was that screen?
That screen was
This is
really
circular.
big.
What you gotta do,
Yeah.
you gotta let Speedy tell the story,
Okay.
because you guys are having a conversation right
Okay.
now, and we don't have you on mic.
All right,
So
okay.
it's gonna happen, we're hearing some good stuff, but.
Oh, I forget that
if
he's
you-
not
if
on
you
mic,
start-
yeah.
If you start this
Well, he is on
story-
mic, but not really.
Not really.
Did we record that conversation about the screen hitting and the bringing the screen up? Did
I don't
we
remember.
record that?
Did we?
I don't
This
remember.
has been going on for so long.
I was just thinking a minute ago, I don't know what I've really spoken about, what I haven't, you know.
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we talk about the screen? You can. Why don't I ask?
How big was it? It was that big. I don't really know.
Tell
It was
me-
big. You know?
I don't know, 30, 40 foot diameter,
Easily, yeah.
roughly.
Yeah.
All right.
You know, that's the thing I got to tell you, when I see people do interviews, it always pisses me off when they get all that shit wrong. You know, especially when I was there. That's why when you're asking me some of these things, like, how big was that thing? I'm like, oh, God, if somebody does look at this at some point, they're going to go, you're so full of shit, you know?
You need a cheat sheet right there.
Exactly.
What I wanted to hear was, you know, a couple more of those stories, like, you know, the pig turns into a condom. That, you know,
Right.
Also, you know, just, you know, on the Pink Floyd tour, we had this huge screen, and we had to bring it up this way, and
Right.
if you did it wrong, we lost a few lights, and, you know.
Yeah,
just
we
kinda-
did say that, didn't we? We talked about that.
Yeah.
I think we've talked about the screen earlier on. I was thinking that.
And where I was just going with that was the which was all about what you were talking about, is that we would split that job up. You know, one person would run the e-stop and one person would run the computer, and the computer had, and you could read the encoders. So you could see that certain motors were running, you know, and if one of them stopped, because there was so much fog and haze and stuff, that the person on the e-stop is looking up there to make sure that that screen, as it's tracking down stage, is tracking down stage on the I-beams, right? If one hits its encoder early for some reason and stops, then you start getting this going on with the screen. And you sure as hell don't want to tip it at that point, because tipping it, taking that next cue, and actually it was fully automated. It read the encoders, and when it got to a certain number, certain motors stopped, and others continued to make it do its deal. And then there was that certain point, there's this little, like, couple of seconds where the screen would make its fall and get caught by the other motors, which would always freak the band out in the very beginning. You know, I mean, it would completely freak them out, because it was like this thing, it was a towering, huge screen that was over the shoulder.
Let's do that. Let's talk about the first time the band comes on stage and sees the set and sees the lights.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like for them? How do they react to it?
Well, the first time any act comes on stage, they have, and you know, I could go on with this for a long time, but that's always, they come on with either, they can either be oblivious to it, they can come on with amazement, with skepticism, all of the above. But once you start, and a lot of times they may not anticipate the effects, you know, that are going to be done until they've seen them, you know. I had, you know, Pink Floyd was a good one. We were talking about the screen, and, you know, the whole idea that the screen was all run on hoists and motors that were encoded. And those signals would go back to a PC and read on that custom software. And so one person operated that, and one person held an emergency stop button and stood under it. So whoever had the emergency stop button was looking up and watching how that screen was moving. Because invariably, sometimes an encoder wouldn't work. And if it didn't, then that meant that one motor would stop early, which meant that the other would keep going, which meant that the whole thing could tweak and still go into its next cue, which would make it flop over, which it was supposed to do. Now, when things worked right on it, which was most of the time, it would track to a certain point. It had different cues, but in the cue where it fell over, it would literally tip, and the front motors would catch it, as they should. But that's still that point of balance. Same thing when you stand it up. You know, you stand it up, it gets to a point, and then it's got to swing and go up, and that needed to be steadied by someone on the bottom. When it fell over or flipped over, it did its thing. And the first time that happened, yeah, the band looked over their shoulder, and they were pretty much, you know, running for cover. And then it was explained that it's all going to be okay, but and then after a while, they're really literally putting their lives in your hands and trusting that you're going to do what's right. The same, you know, a lot of the recycler tour on ZZ Top, we had this whole junkyard set where we were having car crushers and recycling type things. So we had this gantry crane that it had like a big fake electromagnet that would come and pick up fake pieces of, you know, the band and stuff, and then keep dropping them into this car crusher, and the doors would open up and it'd drop in the car crusher, and this thing would track, these towers would track up and down and stuff, and people had to be, you know, you had to watch this stuff, make sure you didn't run anybody over. And it would go to a certain point where you had a conveyor belt that was coming out, so the band would disappear, they would get picked up by this big claw, so to speak, right? So the claw would come down and they'd disappear behind it, go backstage, and then it would pick them up and there would be these dummies hanging out of it, and it would drop the dummies into the car crusher, and I'd be inside this thing. But the car crusher had to track downstage. So you would walk downstage with a, you know, with a headset trying to make sure it doesn't get tangled in anything, and then also with a fog. It was a fog machine with a hose, so I'd be like spewing fog so that now you can't see, and now the doors come open, and now we were trying to figure out a way to catch these props, because these props, the claw would come over, and it would drop these props into there, which were dummies. And, you know, I'm trying to catch them. So I'm trying to, in that point, you're catching the dummies, finding a place to throw them out of the way, and then we had these faked foam cars that, with fake breakaway sides, you know, foam core, that the band would get into. So now we'd get the band in, we'd line them up in there in their little foam cars, and then get them down to the conveyor belt, and then cue the guy to turn the conveyor belt out, and then shoot him back out of the stage. This was all one cue that had to happen fast. And the challenge to all of that was obviously trying to see in the smoke, trying to catch these props and get them out of the way, and then presetting these cubes with just one side off so that you could, because they had like 4 sides that would fall off of them when they busted out of them. So you had to preset them so that the boys could get in, you could close them in, turn them around, and shove them out the door.
Meanwhile...
And the thing's tracking too.
Right.
So this thing would be tracking in and out. So, and it was all rehearsed. You know, and as you got through it, it was like talking to you about things refine themselves as you go down the tour. Then I rigged a net. I had this net to catch the dummies. So instead of me trying to like catch them and, you know, get hit in the head with them and then try to fish them through everything and get them out of the way, because there was like a dressing room in the back portion of this set that this whole car crusher would track back into. But it did have to track out far enough so that it was over the conveyor belt. You know, so you had all these cars were preset in the back, so it was really about getting the bodies over that, get them preset, get the band into them, and send them out, and then hopefully not lose their hats on the way out the door. And I was called into dressing rooms on a regular basis for losing their hats, which, you know, because it was a slit drape. Once the conveyor belt goes, off they go. So it was literally one of these things where they would turn to me and go, "Watch my hat, Speedy," and he'd push it down, push his hat really down, and then shove him out the door, and off they'd go. It was quite bizarre, as ZZ Top should be. I think it was very, very bizarre.
What else?
What else should we talk about?
What other kind of...
I thought if you had a couple more just great anecdotes, I mean, the Pink Floyd stuff's great, that ZZ Top stuff, you know, something, you know, that you can tell in a minute that's just,
well, you know, going
the Stones or...
Going back to Zoo TV, you remember the cars on the Rams. Well, that was another type of gag that was about a lot of weight coming down, you know, going up and down on Rams and on limits. And some of those limits sometimes, because that was all run off of a very small lighting console, and sometimes you could see things better than others. And there was one that was particularly a drag because it was right over the Edge's guitar area. So when he would be under their guitar tuning or whatever, sometimes we'd miss that limit and crash that car into the deck. And it would, you know, it'd do more damage to the car than anything else, but it was always very disconcerting on their end. You know, they didn't know what that noise was, and needless to say, we weren't always happy about that kind of stuff happening either. But that, you know, a lot of that's going on every day. Things are different. Things are happening. People are in places you don't necessarily know they are, and you're always trying to keep up with that and that Murphy's Law, that whole deal, you know.
Well, I guess you try to control the environment as much as you can, you know, because you have to be sure that you're going to be standing here when this happens, otherwise.
And you learn a lot of that as you go. You know, it's trial and error. A lot of it is in the rehearsal phase of it, or in the first, you know, I keep saying your first week or two is still rehearsals. I don't care what anybody says. That stuff, nothing is dialed in for I've never been on a tour where things were dialed in at the first, second, third stop.
Have you ever been somewhere on a show and expected something to happen and it didn't? Or been somewhere on a show and something happens that nobody expected? Wow, this is amazing. Or I never thought that had happened.
On a show, like specifically like something on the show itself, or
We went over this. You asked that question.
Did I?
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting to me that you call these things gags.
yeah,
And I've never heard that. It's
Have
like
you really?
it's
Oh,
like
it's a gag, yeah.
it's like a comedy routine.
that's a term. Yeah, that's a term that we would use on the road.
So can you define that, and how do you come up with those gags? Who comes up? Okay, we're doing this show. It's a straight concert, but we want to add this stuff. So who talks about it? Do you guys have a meeting to see how you can pull it off? How the safety thing is, you know, the timing and all that. How do you come up with the gags?
When you come up with the gags are come up with before the tour. Now, it's fair to say, and actually, that actually helps me answer your earlier question. But yeah, you have depending on the tour, you have a show designer, and they put their heads together. I was recently actually reading the Lighting Dimensions article about Pink Floyd. I found the 1990 magazine or whatever, and they were talking about it or whatever, and it was talking about, you know, the people in charge, Robbie Williams and Mark Fisher and Mark Brickman. They were the ones that put the whole concept together, and each of their talents complemented each other as to the creativity versus the reality versus the logistical feasibility. But a gag, so to speak, and these are all gags. The thing we were talking about was ZZ. I mean, that's a gag. They were the band of gags, you know. Pink Floyd flying a bed in from the back of the stadium. I mean, this is, you know, you go back to that whole thing. I mean, that was a 140-foot crane that would get erected in every city. And in old towns like Verona, you know, in the middle of some old Italian town, people are like looking up like, what the hell is that? And then stringing aircraft cable from that, not even aircraft cable, steel cable, over the tops of stadiums all the way backstage, and then flying a bed down it. And that thing would literally have little silly, like, you know, lights and stuff in it that were battery powered. I had to go climb up that crane every day and put a battery in that thing and strap it in and make sure it didn't fall out when it went flying over people's heads every night. But it's a gag. It's a gag. Flying a pig's a gag. Or what we refer to as a gag, you know. And going back to things being unexpected, yeah, things happen that are unexpected with that. That would inevitably, that bed would crash into stuff when it hit the stage, because it would come in and there was a brake line on it, and you'd hit the brake line, but sometimes, you know, you hit it a little too soon, a little too late, and you had pyro behind it that exploded, and so there was inevitably things that would happen that were unexpected, and you dealt with them at the time.
And meanwhile, you've got headsets on, you're listening to headset traffic, cues are being called, band is playing, audience is screaming.
You know, the more you mention it, the more I think is these things happened every day, unexpected things. There was something to talk about every day. You know, it could be minor, it could be big. There was something specifically actually that I just thought of and
Went away?
Went completely away. Something that was that had happened that was unexpected. And I'm not sure now. I lost it.
Well, you travel so much. If you could, and I know this is going to be hard because you've been in so many different places, but if there was a show in a place that was like the perfect place and the perfect show, was there ever the time when you thought, this is fucking amazing?
Yes, many times. Many times. I mean,
Pick a couple.
A couple examples were, I don't even know so much. I mean, you kind of led me into thinking more, not so much of the perfect shows, but just moments.
Moments.
You know, like I remember like watching U2 in rehearsals and not really being the hugest fan of them up until then, and going, this is a really good band. This is just a rehearsal. You know, and it was just in a stadium, and it was just a really, really great band. And it was the same thing with the Stones. You know, we used to have B. Oliver used to set up a bar underneath the stage, and it was a lounge that was right under the stage. So if you weren't doing anything, you could just hang out down there. And we would also have, you know, we would actually throw parties there after the show. But sometimes, you know, you'd be sitting down there during the show and go, might not be the best bar, but we got the best band in town, right above you.
Right above us.
And that was cool. You know, and yeah, I mean, the show in Versailles was huge. The show in Venice. These are things that I was like, look where I am. Look what we're doing. This is stuff that people haven't done before, and that I can look back 20 years later and go, that was cool, and it'll still be cool then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a soundbite.
Yeah.
Very cool.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Now, is there anything else that we haven't talked about? That
Well, one thing you haven't asked that you usually do is how does being on the road affect the family?
Oh, yeah, exactly. On the road and your personal life. How's that affected?
Being
Maybe
on,
talk about why you waited till you're not on the road anymore because now.
yeah, no, that one's good for me. That one's good for me. How do I start that?
Well, you know, being on the road has
Being
a
on
lot
the
of
road.
challenges.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Being on the road has a lot of challenges to your life and your personal life in general. I say this to people all the time that ask me what it was like to be on the road, and I always say the same thing. I don't regret a moment of it. I'm so glad I did it, and I'm so glad I did it, when I was single, when I was young. The notion that you can not have a place to live, and that you do not have to pay rent, that you can put your stuff in storage and bank all that money, and that you can go from town to town and you can meet different women and hang out with different people. And yet the whole time I did that, I was out there with people that had families, and I could never understand it. I couldn't understand it. And these were people that are, at the time, were the age I am now. And sometimes they'd bring their families out for a while, and that would work for a while, you know, but it would drive it. Goes back to living on the bus. It's fine when somebody's wife comes out to visit, or somebody's wife and kid come out to visit for a day, maybe two. But after a while, they're in your house, and they're not your wife, and they're not your kid. You know, I waited a long time. I met my wife on the road. That's where I met her. Ironically, I met her cruising for chicks in Gothenburg. She was the bartender in the bar that I really liked to go, you know, in Sweden. You know, it was like a kid in a candy store there. And, but that was, you know, where I met her. And after that, it wasn't long after that that I stopped touring. But I think in my case, it was more of an evolution of career too. I was doing more lighting and more lighting design and moving in that direction. And she had a fundamental role in basically looking at me and saying, hey, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. But it is, I think it's a very individual thing, and I think it is, I'm not going to say that people that have families shouldn't go on the road, not by any means. I think it's a lot easier if you're single and if you're young, because it's not easy. I mean, physically it's hard work too. I mean, you learn, as most people that are good at it know, that you supervise, that you don't bolt every truss together yourself. That's why you have these guys to do it every day. You get them on your side, and you get them to do what you tell them, and know how your stuff. Know that this is the hand that end of the cable to the guy and go. Don't tell him go in that box and grab that cable and run. He's going to run it the wrong way. He doesn't know. So your job is to know your stuff and know how to delegate work. So, you know, in that respect, I think I'm getting off topic a bit here. It's physically a demanding job too, even though you're supervising people, because of the hours, because of just in general. So I don't know that it's something you want to be doing when you're, you know, a lot older. But there are those that do, and they do it well, and more power to them. I'm glad in my case that I'm not.
Definitely a young man's sport.
Yeah, and a great one. I mean, you're traveling around the world. And if you're lucky, you're doing it with a, you know, with a cool act. I personally believe, and maybe it's only because I'm older, that you don't find those acts that I was fortunate, or not, the options or opportunities to do the amount of tours I did with the people that I did it. I don't see that now. I don't, you know. There's still some really great acts out there, and there's some really good stuff, but the lineup at the time, and in my case, a lot of it had to do with being in the right place at the right time.
And so you were.
And so I was. So I was.
Thank you, man.
Thank you
very much. Very cool.